our wonderful host, Christine from FiddleSticks Bread, and she's going to help us with sourdough tonight, which I'm very excited about. So thank you.
I would be more excited if it wasn't quite so hot today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Christine. I've been baking bread for a very long time, it feels like. I grew up with home-baked bread. I went to NATE in 2007 for the culinary program. I have a nut allergy, so the baking program was not an option for me. But there I had an intro into traditional bread baking, and that's when I really started focusing on it. I've been baking, sorry, just turn that off. I've been baking for farmers market for about a year, and I baked from my home for a couple of years before that. I have not a lot of sourdough experience, pure sourdough, because I usually add commercial yeast to my sourdough starter to make it a little bit faster, and also because I bake in quantity. The methods that you see online are just not practical. So I'm going to show you how to score, to shape, to mix, and about your sourdough starter. And we're going to do it in a mixed up order. Because I have bread ready to go in the oven, I'll score it two different ways. You can see how it comes out of the oven by the end of the night. And in between, we'll do all the other steps back and forth. And partway through, we'll stop for questions. A lot of the instructions for sourdough bread suggest a cold ferment for like 12 hours. So you shape your bread, you put it in the fridge overnight, and in the morning you fire up your oven, and then you throw your bread in the oven. That's not practical if you're baking more than one loaf, or you have a small fridge or a shared fridge. So I just do mine on the countertop. I also don't have any fancy baskets for my bread or enough bowls. So I use a kitchen towel. And I think you can probably see, but I'll flip it out. And all I use to hold it in place are some handy dandy paper clips. And then if you grab it, I don't know how well you can see. You just grab it and you can just slip it right out, and it rolls out onto your, can't see, I'm going to adjust, excuse me, onto your parchment paper. So when I do it I usually do 2 loaves at a time because you're going to this effort. Well, I do only 1 loaf. And so when I put them in the towel, you get an oval shape. But you can easily put it in a bowl. You can make a round shape in your cotton with just how you adjust it with your clips. Now you can use a lame, which is a curved blade on a stick, the razor blade, to score your bread, or I find it works well. I like to score my bread with a single line down the center. You move pretty fast. The slower you go, the more it will catch on the sourdough because it's wet and sticky generally. If you want to add some extra little scores in on the side, you can. Or if you want to do it 3 lines across the top, you can do that as well. And so what I have here is this loaf, just scored a little bit, and this loaf down the center on the side. This is my fancy peel. It's an edgeless cookie sheet. My oven is just not quite hot enough. I'm going to give it a few minutes. The thing with sourdough is it's very forgiving. If you don't put it in right away, it will be okay. Because it has a slow ferment yeast, it's not going to over ferment unless you're leaving it like an extra hour or an extra 2 hours. I started the mix on this particular batch at 2:30 this afternoon, and it's warm in here. I have an old house with big trees, so it doesn't get too hot. It's about 22, 21 in here, but it's still, the starter was super fast. Just before I started, I mixed up a dough, and I'll show you what it looks like coming out of the mixer. I just have a standard KitchenAid mixer. I do have a bigger one, but it doesn't actually have that much more capacity. So it is kind of like Play-Doh consistency. And I just like to give it a little quick knead. Then I cut it in half and I give it a gentle shake. So you can, I'm holding it up so you can see it, but you can fold it over and give it a little knead and keep turning it a quarter turn and keep folding it over. And then what I like to do is you put your palm down and you can make it into a ball. Then on a little bit of flour, just put it there. Do this one quick and get it out of the way. Then I let it sit for about 20 minutes. That line's going to be right in my eyeballs. And I cover it with a piece of plastic. And give that about 20 minutes. Now, I have another one that I started a couple hours ago. It's not quite ready yet. It looks like this. It's hardly even risen. And you can see that it is, I'll just pull it out so you can take a look at it. It is, well, it's more dense. It hasn't had the full rise. You're not getting the recovery when you push on it yet. And but it should be ready probably in another hour or two. With your sourdough bread, you kind of want to knead it. There are instructions that say knead it every 20 minutes for the first 3 hours, and then knead it every hour for however long, and you only fold it and then turn and then fold it and then turn and then fold it and turn. That's way too much. If you want to have a very perfect Instagram bread, go ahead and follow those instructions. If you just want a tasty loaf that's perfectly fine, then you can give it a little bit more. The reason why they say that is they don't want you ripping the gluten. Let me do it. I'll over knead this and you'll see what I mean. You start kneading it too much, you'll get ripping. I don't know if you can see it. It's starting to tear here. That's what they're trying to prevent you to do by just doing the turn and fold. I think it's a four-point fold that was most common for a lot of the online instructions. But you can take it till it's just starting to do that, and then pop it into your covered container bowl with a cloth, and let it sit, and then come back to it when you're able to. The more if you need to let it rest before you knead it again, so the gluten has time to absorb the moisture and build strength. So when you fold it, you're building strength, but if you do it before it's completely absorbed, then you're going to be ripping your gluten and defeats the purpose. So when you're just starting your bread, why we have you doing it every 20 minutes is because it's rapidly absorbing that moisture. So you can knead it a little bit more often. If you're doing more aggressive knead, you just need to give it a little bit more time. Okay. Forgot to pre-fill my not fantastic dollar store water bottle, which I have to hold the spray onto the bottom or it falls onto the oven door when I'm spraying. Anything really works. You can use ice in a hot pan to add some steam to your oven. I have a gas oven, So it actually has quite a bit of moisture in there, and the steaming is not as important. The reason why you do steam is in the initial stages of the bread going in the oven, what you're doing is you're cooling the surface of the dough off so that it can expand, has more time to expand. Otherwise, the outside of the dough hardens up while the yeast is still active in the bread, because it has to hit a certain temperature before it kills the yeast. Once it kills the yeast, it'll stop expanding. So the point of the steam is to allow it to expand for as long as possible before it hits that temperature internally. Okay, my oven's hot enough. You can see that my bread has flattened out quite a bit and it's opened up. It's all good. Now I know I don't have a light. Well, I have a light in my oven. It doesn't work. If you have a light in your oven that is not heavy duty, do not spray your light bulb. I have done this. You will shatter your light bulb. You need to point your spray away from your light bulb if you have one. So I give it a little bit of spray, pop the loaf in, give it a little bit more spray, and the bread's in the oven, and you can ignore it for about 10 or 15 minutes. I preheat my oven to 500, and then I turn it down to about 450 when I load the bread, and then I keep dropping it. My oven holds temperature really well, so it's not firing all the time, so I can keep it at a hotter temperature. If you have, like I used to have, an electric oven with a poor seal, it's going to fire more often to maintain that temperature. So you're actually going to have to keep dropping the temperature so you don't burn your loaf or raise it up in your oven, and then just cook it longer. Otherwise, it will burn, guaranteed. Meg, do you want to open it up for questions before I talk about the starter? Because that's kind of almost all the different parts of, other than shaping the loaf, which we can do. Let's see. I can shape it right now. I'm going to shape it and put it into the cloth, and then we can open it to questions, and then we'll talk about the starter itself.
Sure, that sounds great.
I'm going to use the same cloth, even though it's a little bit down. It will be fine. I'm just going to cover with more flour. I just keep a whole bunch of these in the bin. And then I always use a dry one. And then while I'm baking, I put them on a cookie sheet flat to dry them out. So if you're doing multiple loaves and you only have a few cloths, then you can do that. You don't wash them. So it'll be just like a baton. You don't want to wash it. You can shake the flour out, or I use my bench scraper. I use a plastic one, so it's not as aggressive it's not as aggressive as a metal one. And then I just scrape it every once in a while. You need to make sure it's really dry before you store it, or else it will mold. And then you just need a new one. Okay, so I'm just gonna get that out of the way. How I like to shape my bread. I'll show you how I like to do my oval bread, and how I'll shape a round one, and I'll put them in the same cloth, and you can see how you can work that. What I like to do is flatten it out with my fingertips. You don't want to be too aggressive, but the sourdough is pretty stable, so you're not going to really overwork it here. Then I fold it just over halfway, and then fold the corners into the middle. So you end up getting kind of like an envelope, and you do that on the other side, just over half in. Then I use my thumbs to make a crease down the middle, fold it over. And then I use the side of my hand to seal that seam together. Now, depending what stage your dough is at, it will like that more than other times. And then, just like if you've done a jelly roll, you kind of pull it towards you and it tucks a bit tighter. If you pull it towards you, it'll tuck that a little bit tighter. You can roll it over. And you can shape it long, you can give it pointy ends, you can make it a little bit stubbier and point it down if you want more of an oval shape. If you're doing a round one, it's very similar to how I pre-shaped it. I just fold it and turn until I've gone all the way around, maybe 150%, 1.5 times. And then I do the same thing like buns. You're going to roll that down, and then you're going to, I like to do this. It helps seal that seam again. I'm just going to pop it upside down here. So, my cloth. So you just pop it in your cloth. You want to give a lot of extra space between two loaves because as they expand, they'll get twice as big generally, and they'll start going up over the edge. Now, if you're doing the oval one, you just make it nice and tight, and you can just clip it right like that. For the round one, what I do, because I like to make potato bread and stuff round, you just give it a little extra fabric. So we'll just do this. And then maybe I'll pick up the screen and you can see it. Give everyone vertigo. I don't know. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't you open it up, Meg, for questions?
Sure. I've got a couple from the chat. One says, I don't have an electric mixer to mix. So I assume they're asking, can they do it by hand or what, that sort of thing?
Yeah, you can definitely do it by hand. It's going to take you a bit more time. It'll probably take you 15 or 20 minutes to get it all mixed together. The challenge with mixing it by hand is actually adding too much flour, especially with the sourdough. You don't want it too firm. It should have quite a bit of moisture and be really, I think you saw at the beginning how it just kind of spread right out. That's the kind of texture that you want. That will allow the maximum amount of hydration with the gluten because you have a long build of strength. If you were doing like a French bread, you might, or quicker bread where you're adding yeast, you can make it a little bit denser. It'll give it more structure, and because you're not letting it rise quite so long. But definitely you can do it by hand, and you'll want to add your flour in gradually into your bowl. So whisk it as long as you can, and then start adding, use your spatula, and then eventually just put a thick layer of flour on your countertop, and then knead the flour in on the countertop, and it'll be sticky to begin with, but once it starts holding together, you'll be fine.
Great. So the next question I had is, do you change the fermentation and proofing time in winter versus summer? And how do you tell when fermentation stage is done?
Okay, yeah, so yes. So it will ferment faster when it's warm. Even a difference of 2 or 3 degrees. So in the winter, our house is about 19 degrees, and I don't turn the furnace on when I'm going to bake because it's going to get warm. And then right now it's probably 23 in here. So, and it was a much faster rise for the bread. If you don't want it to rise so fast, you can add more salt to your bread. That will retard the yeast. Or you can add it to your starter, not more than you would put in your bread. So when you're building your starter, you can add it to your starter, and that will slow down the fermentation. If you're fermenting in your fridge, it's not going to make a difference whether it's summer or winter because it's mostly in the fridge. If you're doing the countertop, it will be faster in the summer, which is a bonus.
Great. I have another question. I have an AGA cooker, which has 3 fixed temperature ovens, 450, 350, and 250. Any advice?
So I would put it in, is the cooker so I'm not exactly familiar familiar with that type of cooker. If you can change the temperatures while it's in there, then that's great. You'll just drop it down to the 350 if it looks like it's starting to burn. Otherwise, 450. 450 is just fine. I bake most of my breads at around 450, maybe a little bit cooler, but I'm also loading in. I can get eight 1.5 pound loaves in my oven, freeform loaves. So that's opening in and out. You can't change the temperature at all. Yeah, so then 450. If I would do 450, you may want to do a smaller loaf. So don't go much more than a pound in size. That way it will completely cook before you've burnt the bottom. A little bit of burnt on the bottom is not that big of a deal. You can trim it off. And also, just lost my train of thought. Yeah, I would just do a smaller loaf. And that would, and I don't know if you have a stone in your oven or if you can use a sheet pan. Like I have a couple different sheet pans. I have grandma's, which is quite thin. I use this when I have multiple loaves. I don't put my first loaves on here because it is quite thin. Like you can bend the sides if you're not careful. And then I have a heavier gauge industrial pan. This will fit one pan in a standard oven. I can get these two in my oven, but you wouldn't get two in. So you would, but if you're only baking 1 or 2 loaves, no problem. You can get 2 loaves on a heavier gauge pan, and that will help with the burning. The other thing I've done when I'm loading different types of breads, some that burn more easily, or I can't rotate them. Like I have some on the top, I have some on the bottom. I'll take them out and I'll put them on a cold pan and then pop them back in the oven. I'm just going to take a quick peek in the oven.
So we may burn the bottom.
You might burn the bottom, but my girl, it's okay, Mom. It's just caramelized or pre-toasted. So I'll just pop it out, and you can see where it's at right now. Ooh, it's a little bit soft and hot. Let's not burn my counter. So I can talk about the scoring later. The bread wasn't quite ready to go in the oven. It probably needed another half an hour or so. I can tell that because it took longer to rise and had already caramelized and set. So I probably should have not counted on the extra heat and given it another hour, but it's a good example to show you why it would break like that. So it did break on one of the scoring lines, but not all of them. That means your dough was not quite ready to go into the oven.
So I did have another question about fermentation and how you know when it's done, just by growth, or is there something else people should be looking for?
Yeah, for the sourdough in particular, if you have now you can make a sourdough and add an additional yeast, and you'd use a fraction of what you would use for regular bread, and it would be more obvious because it's more like if you've done regular bread baking, be the similar signs, double in size. It would have the same kind of response when you touch it. With the sourdough, you'll see when you're kneading it that it's kind of staying the same. Every hour, it has pretty much the same texture and feel and amount of air in it. So it's risen about the same amount since you last folded it, and it's still fairly similar, maybe a little bit looser than when you took it out of the mixer. And then you'll hit a point where it's obviously risen more. Hasn't been there any longer since the last time you folded. You're still doing it at an hour interval or about, and it will be significantly fluffier. Then that's anytime after that, within the next hour, you can pre-shape it. And so you pre-shape it into your little balls, give it about 20 minutes to relax. Or if you see it flattening out underneath your plastic, you can start shaping it then, put it in your fabric, and then when to tell to put it in the oven. Because obviously I put it in the oven too soon. You will start to figure that out as you go. And some of the clues are when you look at it, how it's actually risen in the oven. You can go, that one I put in too soon or too late. But generally, it will be, your sourdough won't be quite twice the size like other breads when you want to put it in the oven, because you want that big lift from the sourdough. If you put it in and it's twice the size and it's really soft, so there's no recovery when you pop your knuckle into the top of it, it just won't get as much rise. It will spread out more in the oven, but it will still bake and be tasty.
Does anybody else have questions who's not in the chat? That I can unmute people and you can ask. Oh.
Yeah, so if you find your girlfriend was experimenting with sourdough, I think I'm just going to angle this so I don't have to bend over quite so much. If you're finding that when you score it, it's blowing out either where you're not scoring it or only partially, like mine did tonight, it only expanded in the one area. Generally, I would say that you didn't leave it to rise long enough. And I was telling her to even rise it an additional hour. So the next time you make it, go to the same point in your little cloth of how soft it was, and then give it more time the next time. And as you do it, like I probably have done 10,000 loaves. It's like any skill. The more you do it, the more you'll get a feel for this is what the result I want. How did that happen? What did I do differently this time? And you'll get a better feel for it. If you're finding that it is opening a lot, but not getting a lot of rise, you could be scoring it too deeply, or you've let it rise too long. But with sourdough, it's very hard to let it rise too long. Like you're letting it rise an extra 2 hours in the cloth, or an extra hour in the cloth beyond what would be ideal. So instead of an hour and a half in the cloth, you've left it for 2.5 hours. You're on your countertop, then likely the reason is that it was overrisen. If you're doing it in the fridge overnight, which I haven't done a lot of because I don't have the fridge space for that, it'll be less of an issue. And because of this very slow fermentation, it's going to, and it's cold when it goes in the oven, it has just a little bit, even though it's overrisen, it kind of holds its shape a little bit more before it expands. And you didn't miss the recipe. That we didn't talk about a recipe at the beginning. I think Meg may have posted it on the blog.
Email it to people too. So it should have been in the email where you got the Zoom link. If you didn't get it, please contact me at the end and I'll make sure you can get it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a countertop recipe. There's a lot of information on the internet about doing the overnight ferment if you want it really sour, or you're looking, for that Instagrammable loaf. Or if you're going to be, and another thing that I haven't addressed is cooking it in a cast iron pan. That's something I never did because I never had a cast iron pan. And then once I had a cast iron pan, I was baking too much bread to just use one cast iron pan. So there's lots of instructions on how to do that. So if you didn't get the recipe, just email Meg and she'll email it out to you. But the purpose of the cast iron pan is to have that intense heat all around and the steam. steam allows it to expand. So if you don't have the cast iron pan, you can pre-steam your oven like I did. You can put ice cubes in so it steams throughout. You can steam it as you go. And if you have a gas oven, it's a little bit less of an issue for the steam. And it will just, it will change a little bit on the crust, but it will still work without a steam. It will work without a cast iron pan. You can use it in an electric oven. You can use it in an oven that only has one temperature control. So, but you'll get to know your oven as you do more and more baking.
Yeah, I will definitely email that recipe out. I guess another question is, what are some other things people can maybe do with all of their sourdough starter that they're going to have? Is there other baking?
Yeah, so I'm going to peek in the oven again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I'm just going to turn my oven down. I also left my oven at 500, so it's not going to be a great example of what it should look like when it comes out. It will be burnt. So your sourdough starter. I go through about 6 kilos a week. This bin is full by Wednesday for my week. No one can go through that much sourdough starter. Fear not. You will not drown in sourdough starter. To start a sourdough starter, you only need flour and water. I have had moderate success with only flour and water. I highly recommend when you're starting your starter, you use rye flour. The rye flour has more nutrients in it. It just gets it going a little bit faster. And what you're trying to build is both yeast and bacteria. Your yeast will start building first. It'll be on your grains of your flour if it's unbleached flour. And it's also natural in a number of fruits, like your prunes. So if you notice the bloom on the blue bloom on prunes, cabbages have it as well. If you're finding you're having trouble getting your starter going, pop a prune or a piece of cabbage in and let it sit, and guaranteed the next day it will be bubbling for you. But basically, when you're going to be starting your sour, you're going to decide kind of what type of sourdough starter you'd like. In North America, sourdough starter and levain are Levain are used interchangeably, and it indicates a mixture of flour and water that's half flour and half water, or a true levain has 25% more water, so it's even runnier. When you're starting out, you would mix your flour and water. You can add a little bit of unpasteurized honey. Again, the sugars and the carbohydrates and the nutrients help get the tiny bits of yeast that are left on your flour to start building up. The first couple days, this week, I started, one of these is my old one. That's my old one. I started now I'm going to pour it out. I'm going to pick it up. Let's see. I don't know if you can see that the one on your left has little tiny bubbles, and the one on your right looks more like pancake batter and has slightly bigger bubbles.
Yeah, I can see that.
So the one on your left, I made this week, and it is a liquid levain. It has 125% hydration, so it means that there's, for the amount of flour, there's 125% of that weight of water. It's a bit runnier, and it has little tiny bubbles because it's happy, but it's not very old. My other one, I make it a little bit thicker. It's 100% hydration, and it's a year old. So it has a bit of a different consistency and profile. The first thing to grow is your days of adding an equal amount of water and flour, you're going to start seeing a different texture and a few more bubbles. If after 3 days, it just looks like the same paste you put in on Monday, add your plum, add your cabbage leaf. You could use potato water, you could soak some oats and put that water in, and that will just kickstart it. Then you'll notice it starts changing. You can start to smell it's starting to get a little bit more sour now. That's your bacteria building up and kicking in. And I wrote it down so I would get the right name. When your first bacteria to form is lactic acid. So it's the lactobacillus strain, and the first type is lactobacillus, and it's acetic acid. It's lactic acid. And then later on, as it ages over a couple weeks and months, you'll start to get also not just lactic acid, but acetic acid. Sorry, I got those mixed up. That's why I wrote it down. Also, so then you got your starter. The first week, you add equal amounts of flour and water to your starter. You're going to get a ballooning amount. So when you start, you throw out half your starter, half of that weight that you have left, added in water, and half you add in flour. There are lots and lots of instructions on this. I think I linked a book that has really good instructions, which I moved out of my counter, and I smell my bread. I'm just going to pull it out.
That's the one downside of Zoom. We can't smell it.
Okay, so not the most beautiful bread. I'm not happy with it because it didn't break where I scored it. It didn't get the rise I would like. It's a little bit burnt because it was at 500 for the first 20 minutes, but you can hear it. It's done. So you hear that knocking sound? That's what you're looking for to know that it's done. This one's the same. Has a good knock on it. It has it scored in one of the places that I scored it. And I can tell by the texture of the score that my dough wasn't ready. And that's something you'll just know through experience. And that one reason why it's solid up here like this is because, again, the dough wasn't ready, so it didn't expand before it hit the temperature, or it didn't score it deep enough. But based on my experience, I would say that this is purely, I didn't leave a lot rise long enough. Probably could use at least another half an hour, maybe an hour. Okay. So you built your starter, I think is where I'm at. Over the week to 10 days, you're throwing out half your starter, and you are adding fresh flour and fresh water. First couple days, you want to use dry flour. After that, you can change it to whatever flour you like. I like to use unbleached white flour. It's neutral. I find anything that has a lot of bran in it can tend to, if you're not babying it, get an odd flavor and color and texture. Then after that period of building it, and it's about a week and a half, and it's really active. You're getting lots of bubbles. It's rising and falling every day. Then you can start treating it as an established starter and start using it. Now, you can see how it exponentially grow, or you're throwing out a lot of flour. And I like to use organic flour. You don't want to be throwing that out. And waste not, want not. So, you can, if you're going to be using your starter regularly, you're going to be baking every 2 or 3 days, keep it on your counter or in your refrigerator. If you're not going to be baking for a couple of weeks, you can freeze your starter. They never tell you can freeze it, but it will freeze it. Make sure it's happy. Put it in a freezable container, and you can pull it out, warm water bath, and you can use it in an hour. So you don't have to keep feeding it. When it's warmer like this out, if you're leaving it on your counter, you're going to have to feed it every day. It just is going to go through that growth cycle. If you keep it in your fridge, you won't have to feed it every day. You can get away with once a week, but it changes the flavor because the lactic acid in a loose, liquidy, 125% starter, it likes the warm temperature. So you'll get, and the lactic acid gives it a really nice mouthfeel. The sourness comes from being cold, and that comes from the acetic acid, which is, just one sec, which is why you have a lot of overnight fermentation for sourdough breads. So if you really love that sour flavor of the sourdough bread, you'll want to keep your starter in the fridge, and you'll want to rise your dough overnight or during the day in the refrigerator to build that acetic acid sour flavor. I prefer my bread a little bit less sour, more like an everyday bread, especially if you're maintaining a sour and you need it for your sandwiches and your French toast and all your different things. If you leave it on the countertop, you'll have a milder, it will still be just as active, both of them, but you'll have a milder flavor to it. The title of the book is, just one second.
I think, is it one of the ones you sent me? Because I have 3 that you sent me.
Yes.
Okay, so the three that Christine sent me were Sourdough Recipes for Rustic Fermented Breads, Sweets, Savories, and More by Sarah Owens, Handmade Bread by Dan Leppard, and Bread, a Baker's Book of Techniques and Recipes by Jeffrey Hamelman. And I can send those out with the recipes.
Yeah, this is Jeffrey Hamilton's original version. I picked it up when I was at NAIT. It was their, the Baker's Bread textbook. It has really good instructions. It's not completely sourdough, but it has a whole section on levains where you can add yeast, or it tells you which breads benefit from overnight fermentation. Sarah Owens' book is an excellent book for the home baker. And the reason is she has many, many recipes that use the sourdough starter in different ways. Cookies, tortillas, muffins. And her bread recipe instructions, they're different than mine, but I followed her instructions and they turn out. So you have really good consistency, the pretty interesting flavors. She has a beet bread in there. She has a leek turmeric bread, multigrain breads, and I always make her tortilla recipe. And so it's different ways that you can use your sourdough starter. The other thing is you can use your sourdough starter as an egg replacement in cookies and some baking if you're vegan. So I have a daughter who's vegan, and that's a recent, so we've been playing with getting the texture, like the cookies just, we couldn't get that soft texture without honey or the eggs. And so we started using a couple of tablespoons of sourdough starter in our cookies when we're not using the eggs, and it adds that gummy texture that an egg adds to your cookies. You can use it like buttermilk, especially if you have a really runny white levain that's like 125% water, or you can take your thicker one and thin it out with some water, and then use it as a buttermilk replacement. When I do that, I usually treat it kind of like milk and add some lemon juice or vinegar in addition to the starter to get more of the buttermilk consistency. So biscuits or cakes that use buttermilk, you can use your sourdough starter.
That's great. Does anybody else have any questions? I think Other than the book, I don't see any in the chat, but if there's any other questions people have.
See what else I said I was going to talk about. If you want to make rye bread, you don't have to maintain multiple sours. You can just adjust them. If you want a thicker starter, add more flour the night before you're going to bake, and or put it in the fridge if you want it to taste a different way, or leave it on the counter. You can play with it that way, and then you can transform. You can build a new starter by taking your rye flour and your water and adding a little bit of your starter to that, and then you'll get a rye starter. German rye starters are generally almost 40% water. So you have a lot more flour. You'll have like 4 ounces of flour to 2.5 ounces of water. It'll be a lot stiffer. But again, that's really easy to build. I often, when I'm making my rye breads, I just build that the day before. So it has 12 or 14 hours to build up with just a tablespoon of the white starter. Add it to my flour for my recipe to build that rye sour.
Great. So I do have a couple questions that came in. So when you replace starters in place of buttermilk or eggs, do you have to change the flour amounts in the rest of the recipe? And how much starter is equivalent to an egg or buttermilk when you're doing it?
I would say you're probably about 2 tablespoons would be an egg. And yes, it's going to change the texture. And you'll need to play with it a little bit. There's not a hard and fast rule on the buttermilk. You can pretty much do 1-to-1. I would thin it out a little bit, depending on how, because I keep my starter a bit thicker. But if you're keeping a really thin and a very happy starter, then you can use more of it. If your sour has been ignored for a few days, or it's been in the fridge and it hasn't been fed for a week, you're only going to use half that, because it will have a different texture and it'll have a really strong flavor, and it won't react the same way in your baking.
I'd have another question. My starter's been in the fridge for several weeks. Is it still usable?
Definitely. So some of the things that happen with starter is you'll get it to separate, and you'll get a layer of liquid on top of your solids, basically. It is recoverable. You don't want to use it like that. It will be way, way too acidic. It will have a flavor to it and a mouthfeel like a banana peel. So you'll get that kind of bitter and astringent taste, and that will carry out in your baking. And you will not get a nice little bit of that. However, I would pour some of that off and then use it as a seed for a new starter. So go down to have like a 1/4 cup of it, add a cup of flour and a cup of water, baby it for a couple days, feed it even twice a day or once a day for 4 or 5 days, and it will be right back. And again, you can throw in a plum or a cabbage leaf, and you'll give it a little extra love.
That's great. And it's another question here. In the recipe given to us through the email, so some people did get it good. There's an ingredient, mature culture. Can there be a substitute for that?
Yep, that's your sourdough starter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you don't want to use it only a week old, or if you do, that's not considered a mature culture. So, but really, you can start baking with it after a week, as long as you got some good action. So you're getting bubbles, you got a good smell to it, then you can, and what is a good smell? How do you describe it? If it's pleasing to you. If it smells funky, it's not happy. So if you like sourdough bread and you know that aroma of sourdough bread, you're going to kind of smell that. It could be a buttermilk smell, or it could be like a sauerkraut smell, but it's not paint thinner. If it's paint thinner, you need to pour some of that off, give it a little bit of love with more flour and water for a couple days. It will turn into paint thinner. You'll have that happen.
Oh, good. There was a thank you for that, so that's good. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Has anyone tried to use a sourdough starter before and have had specific challenges or questions about the way the bread came out of the oven or some instruction that you saw that's different than what I said? I could maybe explain why the differences are there.
No, everything's gone right for everybody the first time. I'm impressed.
Well, I'm going to cut open one of these loaves of bread. I would normally not cut it open for at least an hour, especially if you're making rye bread. If you're making like anything more than 60% rye, you want to leave it for 12 hours before you cut into it.
Oh, I did get one. Somebody said they'd heard that you should only keep a small amount of starter, like a few tablespoons. Is that no?
If you keep too little of starter, it's going to go through its growth cycle too fast, and it won't be happy. So if you're trying to maintain only a half a cup of starter, you're going to find that it peaks and rises really quickly. You're going to start getting that liquid separation. Like you can put it in your fridge, but it needs a bit of critical mass. I would say that the 8 ounce, I wouldn't do much less than 8 ounces, and then you're adding 4 ounces of water. You know, reserve it or give it to a friend or put it in your compost and add to your 4 ounces remaining, 4 ounces of water, and 4 ounces of flour. And I can feel that this bread I'm not happy.
I got a couple cheese questions here. So if you're adding cheese or other ingredients, at what point do you add them? And if you're using lactose-free milk or margarine, will that change anything? So
no, because I've used melt before, or why you're adding butter or the oil is it adds moisture to your bread. It changes the texture of the bread. It'll become stretchier, and it will have a different final crumb to it. So when you're making a brioche or a cinnamon bun or whatnot, you can use olive oil. You can use your soy butter because the fat is there. That's what you're adding. And the reason why you add butter is because it tastes delicious. If you think it tastes delicious, but if you don't eat butter, then that's not a flavor that you're looking forward to. I often make roasted potato bread. And I use olive oil, the same amount of olive oil you'd put in cinnamon buns for butter. So you can definitely add it in. You want to add your ingredients at the end of mixing. So the doughs come together. It looks almost homogeneous or fairly homogeneous. You don't have too many lumps in there. And then you can add your ingredients. You're going to want your dough to be fairly loose. So it's going to be quite soft when you add your other ingredients. If you're adding grains, I recommend that you soak them overnight before. Anything really hard like a rye or a whole berry, like a wheat berry or barley, I would cook it, at least par cook it, so it's softened and leave it soak from there overnight. Cornmeal too, leave it soak overnight. If you're adding raisins, what I like to do is just wash them. So you rinse them with water and drain them. And then they're not so plump that they fall apart when you put them in the mixer, but they're not dry and pull moisture out of the bread. Because if you're adding things that are dry, it's going to take the moisture out of the bread and going to get your bread. Your bread's going to be tough and hard to work with. You're not going to get that rise. It's going to start ripping, especially because you've added the grains or the cheese or the whole wheat flour or whatnot. That cuts the gluten, and it's a less strong loaf. I got the tea towels from Superstore. That's what I use. I was picking up some word escaped me, some unbleached cotton from the fabric store, and I highly recommend you hem the edge so you don't get the strings. But it wasn't heavy enough. It was either canvas or too thin because you're just going to use it to make a test dress or something like that when you're sewing something. So I find if you get a good quality tea towel, you don't want anything with crevices or bumps because they're going to stick and they're going to leave a pattern. It'll be just a little bit more difficult to work with. So a lot of the old-fashioned tea towels, like your grandma's tea towels, are the best because they have that dense weave. You can also order them online, but I haven't found a place that you can get just a few at a reasonable price. They're like asking $20, and you can. It will be beautiful and wonderful and give you joy. But if you don't have $20 to spend, you can spend $2 or $5 and find the thickest one that you can with the tightest weave in your price range.
So I had two more questions. One is my bread tends to flatten in the oven. What causes that?
So two things can cause your bread to flatten. Actually, look at it. It looks quite nice on the inside. Has nice even structure. So I guess I was a little bit hard on myself. These beautiful, smells delicious. Okay, can you see the question again?
Sorry, yeah, it was my bread tends to flatten in the oven. What's the cause of that?
Yes. If it's flattening in the oven, it's too moist. So, for example, when I do an 80% rye, if I steam the oven, it goes flat like a pancake. There is no lift on it. And part of the reason is because the structure is not strong enough. So you can try kneading your bread more often or stronger. Because like I said at the beginning, some of the instructions are to just like fold it 4 times and then put it away and then come back in half an hour. Well, if you're not giving it enough structure or you've let it rise too long, it's going to go flat. So you, in your case, could try rising it a little bit less, say half an hour less, and not putting steam. Try some, if it's always going flat, it's something you're doing consistently. Try change one thing and see if it affects how your bread comes out. If you change too many things, what was it that you changed that made it work or not? But my guess is it could have had a bit more structure when you were shaping it or when you were building your dough, or it was over-risen, and that will make it flatten out instead of come up.
Perfect. I had one last question about the thawing. You suggested freezing. Do you freeze it after it's risen or just after feeding? And can you use it right away when you, or do you need to feed it again before you use it?
If your starter's relatively happy, like you're feeding it every couple of days and you like the way it smells and you think that it's happy, you'll tell when it's happy. Then you can freeze it. So it doesn't matter if you've just fed it. I would not put it in the freezer after immediately feeding it because it hasn't had time to populate the flour. And you will lose a percentage of yeast in the freezer. So you can freeze dry yeast, you can freeze fresh yeast. You'll lose a little bit of potency. I don't really notice it. I use fresh yeast, which would be probably the most susceptible to losing potency in the freezer. I don't really notice it. It might mean an extra half an hour of rising. And in sourdough world, that's nothing, right? So I would give it at least a couple hours after feeding it. It could be full risen. It could have collapsed, but kind of anywhere within 24 hours of feeding it, you could freeze it. And then when it comes out, yeah, you can warm water bath it, and half an hour it will be thawed out, and you can use it right away. Save some, and then I often have a bit in the freezer because sometimes something goes wrong and I'm doing a big bake and I need a little bit more, or say a batch burnt, or I had the power go out a couple times this summer. And I had to make bread quick for the market. And so I just pulled my Sourdough out of the freezer, gave it some love, waited a couple hours, and made it work.
All right, I think this is our last question. You talked about hydration of starters. What hydration of final bread is good to aim for? As someone new to this, I think my bread is too hydrated and hard to handle.
Yeah, so if you have a super hydrated bread, that is probably the most challenging. The most challenging thing to make is a white ciabatta bread. It has super high hydration. It's a big blob when it comes out, or baguettes are often made that way too, with really wet dough. It's very sticky and hard to work with. You can make your life easier with the wet dough. I've seen some videos with I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there's a trend of using water. So you get your hands a little bit wet, your counters just a little bit down instead of flour, and you're using your bench scraper to shape it. So you're going to use this motion that I was doing with my hand with your bench scraper. It's going to be a little bit down, and you can do a wet shape with it. That'll help it when it's wet. But those are definitely more advanced techniques. I would drop your water down, and I'm just going to open a book. And I'll tell you what, I thought I wrote it down, but so hydration would be of your 60%, between 60 and 80% is probably pretty easy to work with. 60 would be a little bit stiff. The ciabatta bread, I'll just pull it up to give you an example of what that is like. That's probably the wettest thing you would work with. It's at you can see how I've used my book just a little bit.
Mom's always so open to chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah, so, okay, so a ciabatta has 70% hydration. 70 to 75% hydration. So you're probably going to want to look at a 65%. Yeah, if you're finding it too wet, aim for more like a 65%.
Awesome. This has been really great.
You know, 68% to 73%. Well, that's only 5%. But so if you're finding it hard to work and it's not tightening up as you're folding it through the day, then just add some flour onto your table while you're kneading it, and then when you get to the final shape, not ideal, but if you can work with it better, then that's what you're aiming for. You can flour your hands too when it's really wet, and then just try not to touch it too much, and heavily flour your linen.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Christine. This has been great. I did not know so many things, and I think a lot of people learned a lot. So this was great. Thanks very much for taking us through all of this.
You're welcome. It was lots of fun. And like I said, I wasn't very happy with it, but it smells delicious. It looks divine. You're going to burn a few loaves, but just keep playing with it. If you have any questions, please email me. Or come chat with me at the market. Happy to talk endlessly about bread.